Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. A Meeting at the Edge of the World. The train station at Hemsbrook was an anomaly, an architectural relic of wrought iron and stained glass in a town that had long forgotten its charm. On most evenings, the station was nearly deserted, save for the occasional commuter or traveler with an overstuffed suitcase. But tonight, it pulsed with a quiet, otherworldly energy. Eleanor Mathis wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere, really. After the abrupt end of a 5-year relationship, her world had narrowed to the predictable monotony of workdays and sleepless nights. But something, a flicker of defiance or madness, had propelled her onto this train bound for nowhere in particular. She sat on the cold wooden bench near Platform 3, clutching a dog-eared copy of The Little Prince. It was the kind of book she returned to in moments of crisis, its whimsical absurdity offering a strange comfort. The night air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth, and the station lights cast long, eerie shadows on the platform. The arrival of the 8:45 train shattered the silence. Its whistle screamed through the air like a siren, and steam billowed as it screeched to a halt. Eleanor watched the train doors slide open, expecting the usual trickle of passengers. Instead, only one figure stepped off. A man. He was tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones that caught the light. His dark hair was unruly, as though he had run his hands through it one too many times, and his eyes were a striking shade of amber. He carried no luggage, only a worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder. Eleanor looked away quickly, but not before their eyes met. There was something unsettlingly familiar about him, though she was certain they had never met. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and velvety, tinged with an accent she couldn't place. "Do you happen to know where this train leads?" She blinked. "You were just on it." "Yes, but I got on without asking." He gave a rueful smile, a rather reckless decision in hindsight. Eleanor couldn't help but laugh, a soft, startled sound. "It's heading to Wexham, about 40 minutes south." "Wexham," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Thank you." He hesitated, then gestured to the empty seat beside her. "May I?" She nodded, and he sat, his presence impossibly magnetic. "I'm Lucien," he said, extending a hand. "Eleanor." They talked. At first, it was the usual pleasantries, where they were from, what they did. Lucien was vague about himself, offering snippets of a life that seemed too extraordinary to be true. He spoke of distant cities, ancient ruins, and nights under unfamiliar constellations. Eleanor, in turn, found herself sharing more than she intended. She told him about her heartbreak, her aimlessness, her fear of fading into insignificance. He listened intently, his amber eyes never leaving hers. As the clock struck midnight, a strange silence fell over the station. The air seemed to hum, charged with a tension Eleanor couldn't explain. "I should go," she said, rising. "So soon?" Lucian's tone was light, but his gaze was heavy with unspoken words. "I have work tomorrow." She paused, then added, "Will you be staying in Wexham?" Lucian smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I'll catch the next train to nowhere." Eleanor laughed softly, but the sound died as he stood, towering over her. "Eleanor," he said, his voice suddenly serious, "promise me something." "What?" "Don't stop looking." "For what?" "You'll know." Before she could respond, he leaned in, brushing a kiss against her forehead. It was fleeting, but left her heart pounding. Then he turned and walked toward the shadows at the far end of the platform, disappearing into the night. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find The Little Prince still on her nightstand. But it wasn't the same. The pages were filled with notes in an unfamiliar hand, scrawled in the margins. Every word seemed to be written just for her. Chapter 2. Messages Between the Lines. Eleanor stared at the book in disbelief. The notes were written in a looping, elegant script, each word threaded with an intimacy that made her pulse quicken. The essential is invisible to the eye, but what if you learn to see beyond? Loneliness is not the absence of company, but the absence of understanding. Are you truly alone, Eleanor? Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. Whoever had written these words knew her in ways she barely knew herself. Questions flooded her mind. Had Lucien slipped this into her bag? Was it some elaborate prank? But how could he have known? She thumbed through the book frantically until she found a folded piece of parchment tucked between the final pages. Unfolding it, she saw an address scrawled in the same handwriting. No 17 Holloway Street, Wexham. It wasn't just an address. It was a challenge. The next few hours passed in a haze. She went to work, barely able to focus, her thoughts consumed by the book and the man with the amber eyes. By the time the clock struck 5, she had made up her mind. The walk to Holloway Street was short but felt endless. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where every house seemed to have a story. Number 17 was a small, ivy-covered cottage at the end of the lane. Its windows glowed warmly, but there was no sign of Lucien. Eleanor hesitated at the gate, debating whether to turn back. Then she saw the envelope pinned to the door. It was addressed to her. Her fingers shook as she opened it. Inside was another note, written in the same elegant script. "You've come this far. Step inside, and the truth will find you." The door creaked open with a gentle push, revealing a cozy, dimly lit room. The scent of old books and cedar filled the air. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. On the table near the window was a single object, a music box. She approached it cautiously, her heart racing. The box was exquisitely crafted, its surface etched with constellations and swirling patterns. As she lifted the lid, a hauntingly beautiful melody filled the room. And then she heard his voice, Eleanor. She spun around, but the room was empty. The voice came again, soft and close, as though spoken directly into her ear. "You've always felt it, haven't you? That the world isn't what it seems?" "Lucien?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The firelight dimmed and the air grew colder. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that were almost human. Eleanor backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "This isn't real," she said, clutching the music box. "It's more real than you know," the voice replied. "You're standing at the edge of something vast, Eleanor. But to cross it, you have to let go of the life you've known." The shadows moved closer, their forms flickering like static. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't move. "Let go," the voice repeated, and this time it was no longer Lucien's, it was hers. The room dissolved into darkness, and Eleanor felt herself falling, weightless and infinite. When she opened her eyes, she was standing on platform 3 at Hemsbrook Station. The 8:45 train was pulling in, its whistle piercing the night. In her hand was The Little Prince, but the notes were gone. The address was gone. The music box was gone. Lucien was nowhere to be seen. She looked down at the book again. On the first page, written in that same looping script, were 3 words, "Find me, Eleanor." Chapter 3. The Train to Nowhere. Eleanor stood frozen on the platform, the words, "Find me, Eleanor," seared into her mind. The train doors hissed open, inviting her into its dimly lit interior. There was no one else around, just the faint hum of the engine and the rhythmic ticking of a distant clock. Without thinking, she stepped inside. The doors closed behind her with a soft whoosh, and the train began to move. Eleanor sank into a seat by the window, clutching the book tightly. The world outside blurred into a smear of shadows and light, and the usual announcements were absent. This wasn't a normal train ride. The carriage felt timeless, the air heavy with anticipation. As she glanced around, she noticed strange details. The seats were upholstered in deep velvet, embroidered with stars and planets. The lights flickered in a rhythm that seemed almost alive. Then came the voice, soft, melodic, and unmistakably his. Eleanor. She turned, and there he was, sitting across from her as if he had been there the whole time. Lucien. "You found the book," he said, his amber eyes locking onto hers. "You left it for me," she replied, her voice trembling. "What is this? What's happening?" He leaned back, studying her with a mixture of curiosity and sadness. "You've always felt out of place, haven't you? Like the world was a puzzle missing its final piece." She nodded, unsure of how to respond. "This train," he continued, gesturing around them, "isn't taking you to Wexham. It's taking you to a choice." "A choice?" Lucien leaned forward, his expression intense. "Eleanor, the world you know is only half the story. There's another layer, a place where time bends, where dreams and reality intertwine. I belong to that world, and so do you." She shook her head, her heart pounding. "That's impossible. I'm just me." Lucien's smile was faint, almost sorrowful. "You're more than you think. You always have been. That's why you felt drawn to moments like this, to the unexplainable, the extraordinary. You're a bridge between worlds, Eleanor, and now you must decide which world you want to live in. The train slowed, and Eleanor realized they were approaching a station. But it wasn't Wexham, or any place she recognized. The platform was bathed in a silvery light, and strange figures moved in the distance, their forms fluid and otherworldly. "This is your stop," Lucian said, standing. She stared at him, panic rising. "I don't understand. What happens if I get off?" "You'll step into a world of endless possibility, a place where your every thought shapes reality, where you'll discover who you truly are. And if I stay, you'll return to the life you've known, safe, familiar, but incomplete." The train came to a halt, its doors sliding open. The silvery light spilled into the carriage, and Eleanor felt a pull, as if the very fabric of her being was urging her to step forward. Lucian held out a hand. "Come with me." She hesitated, her mind racing. This was insane. Impossible. But then she thought of the book, the music box, the way Lucian had looked at her as if he'd known her forever. "What if I'm not ready?" she whispered. His gaze softened. "You are. You always have been, but the choice is yours." Eleanor took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at Lucian, then at the glowing figures beyond the platform, and then she made her decision. Epilogue. The passenger. The 8:45 train pulled into Hemsbrook Station, its whistle piercing the quiet night. The platform was empty except for a young man holding a tattered book. He stepped off the train, glancing around as if searching for someone. The book in his hand was The Little Prince, and written on its first page were 3 words. "Find me, Lucian." Chapter 4. Echoes Across Time. The man stood on the empty platform, the weight of the book in his hands feeling heavier than it should. His name was Lucian, though deep down he wondered if that had always been true. The name felt like a thread tied to something distant, something he could no longer reach. The words on the first page, "Find me, Lucian," burned in his mind like a command. But who had written them? And why did they echo with such urgency? He looked up at the darkened station, its emptiness oppressive. Yet, in the silence, he swore he heard whispers. "She's waiting," a voice seemed to say, though it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Clutching the book, Lucian turned and began walking. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of rain and old wood, and the station seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The clock on the wall read 8:45, but the second hand never moved. He passed door after door, each marked with strange symbols that flickered like fireflies. He tried to open one, but it wouldn't budge. The next one was the same, and the next, until he came to the last door on the far end of the platform. It swung open easily, revealing a room bathed in golden light. Inside was a single chair, and on it sat Eleanor, or someone who looked like her. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her eyes, once warm and questioning, now glowed faintly, like embers. She wore a dress that shimmered with shifting colors, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. "You're late," she said, her voice carrying a strange resonance. Lucian stepped inside cautiously. "Eleanor?" She tilted her head, studying him. "Is that what you remember me as?" "You," he faltered, gripping the book tighter. "You told me to find you." "I did," she said, standing. Her movements were fluid, almost too smooth, as though she were walking through water. "And you did. But the question is, do you remember why?" Lucian shook his head, frustration bubbling inside him. "No, I don't remember any of this. I don't even know who I am anymore." She approached him slowly, her presence overwhelming. "You're more than you think, Lucian. Just like I was." He stepped back, his heart pounding. "What do you mean? What is this place?" "This," she said, gesturing around them, "is the edge. The place where everything begins and ends, where choices echo across time." Lucian's mind reeled. "You're not Eleanor. Not anymore." "No," she admitted, her gaze softening. "But I was once just as you were something else before you became Lucian. This place changes us. It reveals who we're meant to be." "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you're the only one who can set things right." She reached out, placing a hand over the book in his grip. The pages fluttered open, and Lucian saw words forming on them, written in the same elegant script he had come to recognize. "To find me is to find yourself. To lose me is to lose everything." Eleanor, or the being she had become, smiled sadly. "You have one more choice to make." The room shifted, the golden light growing brighter until it was blinding. When it dimmed, Lucian found himself standing in a vast, star-filled void. Ahead of him were two paths, one leading to a glowing door, the other fading into darkness. Eleanor's voice echoed in his mind. One leads back to the life you've known, the other to a world where nothing will ever be the same. Lucian hesitated, the book still in his hands. He thought of Eleanor, of the way she had looked at him that night on the train, the way her words had resonated in his soul. "I'm not ready," he whispered, but the paths waited, silent and unyielding. He took a deep breath, stepping forward. Epilogue: The New Passenger. The train pulled into Hemsbrook Station, its whistle cutting through the still night. On the platform stood a woman clutching a leather-bound journal. Her name was Eleanor, or so she thought. As the doors opened, she hesitated, her gaze fixed on the empty carriage. In her journal, on the first page, were 3 words: "Find me always." With a deep breath, she stepped aboard. Chapter 5. Cycles and Shadows. Eleanor, or the woman she believed herself to be, sat in the train's corner seat, the journal resting on her lap. The faint hum of the train filled the silence, a rhythm that felt oddly familiar, like a lullaby from a forgotten dream. The world outside the window was an infinite void of stars, galaxies swirling in patterns too deliberate to be random. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't place where or when she was. She opened the journal. The pages were blank except for the first, where the words "Find me always" stood in looping script. Below them, as if etched by an invisible hand, new text began to form. "You've entered the cycle, Eleanor. Each choice brings us closer to the truth, or further away. Pay attention." A chill ran down her spine. The handwriting was eerily familiar, but it wasn't hers. "Closer to the truth?" she muttered, her voice sounding small in the vast emptiness of the train. "What truth?" The lights flickered, and the hum of the train grew louder, resonating in her chest. She looked up to see the figure of a man standing at the far end of the carriage. Lucian. But this Lucian was different. His face was sharper, his eyes darker, as if shadows had carved themselves into his features. He held the little prince in his hand, its cover worn and torn, as if it had traveled through centuries. "You've returned," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I don't understand," she replied, standing. "Why does it feel like we've done this before?" "Because we have." Lucian stepped closer, his presence commanding. "Every choice, every meeting, every goodbye, we've lived it 100 times over. This is the cycle." Eleanor's grip tightened on the journal. "Then why don't I remember?" Lucian's expression softened, a flicker of sorrow passing over his face. "Because remembering is the final step. And you've never made it that far." The train jolted and Eleanor stumbled, clutching a nearby pole for balance. The stars outside began to shift, their light bending and twisting into strange patterns. Lucian approached her, his steps deliberate. "This place, this train, isn't just a crossing between worlds. It's a test, a labyrinth of choices designed to strip us down to our essence. Only then can we see the truth." "And what's the truth?" she demanded, her voice rising. Lucian hesitated, then opened The Little Prince. The pages fluttered until they stopped on a blank one. Slowly, words began to appear, forming a single sentence. "You are both the creator and the prisoner of this cycle." Eleanor stared at the page, her mind reeling. "What does that mean?" "It means," Lucian said, his voice heavy, "that we're trapped in a loop of our own making. Every time we try to break free, we're drawn back here, to each other." "Why?" "Because some part of us doesn't want to let go," he said, his amber eyes locking onto hers. "Some part of us is afraid of what lies beyond." The train began to slow, the hum fading into a deafening silence. Eleanor glanced out the window and saw a station materializing in the void. Unlike Hemsbrook, this platform was dark and crumbling, overgrown with vines that glowed faintly in the starlight. "This is where the cycle ends," Lucian said. She turned to him, fear and hope warring within her. "And if I don't get off, then the cycle begins again. We'll meet on the platform, exchange the book, and try to remember all over again." Eleanor's hands trembled as she clutched the journal. "How do I know what's beyond this? What if it's worse?" Lucian reached out, his hand brushing hers. "You don't. But isn't it time we tried to find out?" The train came to a stop, its doors sliding open. A cold wind swept through the carriage, carrying with it the scent of earth and something ancient. Eleanor looked at Lucian, then at the platform. "Will you come with me?" she asked. His smile was faint, bittersweet. "That's not how it works. This is your choice." Her heart ached, but deep down, she knew he was right. With a deep breath, she stepped off the train. Epilogue, the end of the beginning. Eleanor's feet touched the ground and the train vanished behind her, leaving her in a world unlike anything she had ever seen. The sky was a swirling canvas of color, the ground shifting beneath her like liquid glass. Figures moved in the distance, some familiar, some alien, but they all carried an air of quiet purpose. And then she heard it, a voice that was both hers and not hers, echoing across the landscape. "Welcome home, Eleanor. The cycle is broken. The journey begins." Far away in the vast void of stars, a train whistle blew one last time. Chapter 6, The First Step. Eleanor stood at the edge of the shimmering world, her breath catching in her throat. Everything around her pulsed with life, colors too vibrant to exist, sounds that resonated in her bones, and a sense of weightlessness that made every step feel like walking on air. This was no ordinary place. It was creation itself, raw, untamed, infinite. She clutched the journal tightly. Its pages, once blank, were now filled with words, maps, and sketches she couldn't remember writing. Each entry seemed to belong to her, yet carried the voice of someone else entirely. The first step is the hardest. The rest will follow. The voice echoed again, and this time it wasn't coming from her mind. She turned to see a figure approaching from the horizon, a silhouette against the ever-shifting sky. It was Lucian, but not the Lucian she had known. This version of him was younger, his face unmarked by the sorrow she had seen in the train. His amber eyes burned brighter, and his presence was magnetic, as though he belonged to this place in a way she didn't yet understand. "You made it," he said, a smile playing at his lips. Eleanor took a cautious step forward. "You said you couldn't come with me." "I couldn't," he replied, his voice carrying a new warmth. "But once you broke the cycle, it allowed me to be recreated." "Recreated?" Lucian gestured at the world around them. "This place doesn't just break cycles. It rebuilds what's broken. It's why we were trapped for so long. We kept clinging to the pieces of ourselves that couldn't exist here. And now? Now, we begin again. But differently." Eleanor's gaze fell to the journal. "So everything, the train, the book, the choices, was leading to this?" He nodded. "Every loop was teaching us, shaping us, preparing us to step into something bigger. This place isn't the end, Eleanor. It's the start of something infinite." She looked out at the horizon, where the landscape shimmered and transformed with every blink. "What happens next?" Lucian's smile widened. "That's up to us." He held out his hand, and this time Eleanor didn't hesitate. The moment their fingers touched, the world erupted in light, flooding her senses with memories, emotions, and truths that had been locked away for lifetimes. She saw the cycles they had endured, the train rides, the choices, the endless search for each other. She saw the world they had left behind, its colors muted and confined. And she saw this new realm, infinite in its possibilities, waiting to be shaped by their will. Eleanor gasped as the light faded, leaving her and Lucian standing hand in hand. "You feel it now, don't you?" he asked softly. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We're not just part of this world. We are this world." Lucian's grip tightened. "And it's time to create." They stepped forward together, the ground shifting beneath their feet, responding to their every thought. Mountains rose in the distance, rivers carved themselves into existence, and constellations danced across the sky. For the first time in forever, Eleanor felt whole, and as they walked into the unknown, she knew the truth. The cycle wasn't a trap. It was a gift, a way to find each other again and again across lifetimes until they were ready to become something greater. Together they would build a world where no one would be lost, where every story could find its ending, and where the infinite wasn't a prison but a promise. As the first dawn broke over their new world, Eleanor turned to Lucian, a smile breaking through her tears. "We found each other," she said. "Always," he replied. And with that, they began.